I'm Faye Jensen, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Thank you for joining the second of our 2023 Winter Lecture Series. Before we get started, I want to remind those of you in attendance that you'll be muted throughout the webinar. I hope that we'll have time for questions at the end, so please type any questions you have in the chat box and I'll read them out once the talk is over. We are so fortunate to have Dr. John Navin with us tonight. Dr. Navin is professor of history at Coastal Carolina University. His publications focus on community, race, and violence in colonial America. A Massachusetts native, Dr. Navin joined CCU's Department of History in 1999 after several years at Pfeiffer University in North Carolina. He holds a master's degree from Boston College and a PhD from Brandeis. Professor Navin teaches courses on the colonial, revolutionary, early national, and antebellum periods. He is the longest serving member of the university's faculty senate and served as Associate Dean of Humanities and Fine Arts from 2001 to 2008, and as interim chair of the Department of Communication in 2009 and 10. Please welcome Dr. John Navin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jensen. I appreciate it. And thank you to the staff, everybody there at the Society. Been very helpful and courteous throughout this. I'm going to share screens here and put a fair number of slides up, but I promise I will do my best not to belabor any one of these slides. I'll keep moving quickly and hopefully leave plenty of time for questions, or at least some time for questions. I do have a book about early South Carolina, and so when Dr. Grady was not able to be here tonight, I thought, well, I'm covering the same ground, so maybe I could try and fill in. If any of you have heard me talk before, I will try to bring something new to it, but for most of you, I imagine this is a new look, so let me get started. The title of the talk is War Against Everyone in South Carolina, 1770 to 1720. That would be the first half century in South Carolina's existence. I'll just start out with this fellow. You may recognize him. This is Charles I with his family, and the little type there is his son Charles, who will be the one who issues the Carolina Grant in 1663. Charles did not get along with Charles I, did not get along with Parliament, and if you know his long sad story, that ended up in the outbreak of the English Civil War. Let me just, the faces here are in the way of my slides, so I'm going to relocate you all. Okay. So the English Civil War, lasting from 1642 to 51, outlasted Charles himself, because he was captured by the parliamentarian force, executed in 1649, and that's when Oliver Cromwell became the guy in charge in England. One interesting thing I'd point out about Cromwell that a lot of people don't realize is that England did not try to regulate its colonies closely prior to this. The first navigation acts that were passed that really tried to restrict the colonial trade to trading with England as opposed to with the Dutch or with the French or Spanish. Those navigation acts were first passed by Parliament during the time that Cromwell was the Lord Protector during the interregnum period. Cromwell was, of course, not entitled to be king. He didn't have that bloodline. He wasn't ordained by God. And so some people just looked at developments when Charles I was executed as the beginning of a time where there would be no monarch in charge, and this was going against God's divine will. The plan for succession had been interrupted. And one of those people who feared for what was going to happen was Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was born in 1588. His father was a disgraced vicar. He was raised by his uncle. He attended Oxford and took tutoring jobs, including one for a member of parliament. And so he was closely connected to Parliament and to the king. He was a true royalist, and he was devastated when they executed the king. And he wrote his famous work, Leviathan. And here's an expression of what he feared. In the absence of an absolute sovereign, there would be no law. Competition for power and wealth would go unchecked. The condition of man would become, quote, a condition of war, everyone against everyone. And I've borrowed from that for the title of my talk tonight. Because this vision that Hobbes had was his vision of what would happen in England in the absence of a powerful sovereign. What I have done in my research and in my writing about early South Carolina is to apply Hobbes' thinking to South Carolina, because I think that it's very apropos. As we'll see, South Carolina is not closely managed. The king and parliament are basically 3,000 miles away and make no effort to rule in Carolina. The proprietors are unsuccessful in ruling in Carolina, and on the ground, Carolina is very unstable as far as governments go. So let's just get into that story in a bit. But first, I'll tell you about a competing philosophy, if you will. Hobbes had this very dark vision, how things would go wrong if people were left unto themselves and competition for power and wealth goes unchecked. But there was another strain of thought that was just coming, that was just growing in popularity, and it was expressed in many places. And in one of those better known places was Bernard Mandeville wrote this poem, Fable of the Bees, in 1714. And here is a passage from that. He compares society to a beehive and says, thus every part was full of vice, yet the whole mass a paradise. Such were the blessings of that state, their crimes conspired to make them great. And virtue, who from politics has learned 1,000 cunning tricks, was by their happy influence made friends with vice. And ever since, the worst multitude did something for the common good. He's arguing, you could say ironically or satirically, about England, saying everyone is out for themselves on the assumption that it will be the best thing for the common good and for the nation if everybody pursues their own self-interest. Here is a current scholar trying to put this in more academic terms than I would ever be able to. Contemporary society is an aggregation of self-interested individuals necessarily bound to one another, neither by their shared civic commitments nor their moral rectitude, but paradoxically by the tenuous bonds of envy, competition, and exploitation. This is what E.J. Hundert says Bernard Mandeville is arguing in 1714. This idea that unchecked competition and personal self-interest will eventually lift everyone and will better not only the individual, but society and the state. This is expressed some years later in the writings of Adam Smith in his famous Theory of Moral Sentiments from 1759. Quote, every individual neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Bottom line, look out for yourself, do everything you can in terms of self-interest, and that will be to the betterment of society as a whole. So there's two very contradictory strains of thought, and Hobbes certainly the darker vision of the two. So let's come back to royalty here and look. We've got in 1660, Cromwell is dead, and the powerful men in England have decided, not just those in charge, but many many commoners in England, feel that they need a king again. And so steps are taken to restore Charles's son. This would be Charles II, who has been in exile. He's been proclaimed the King of Scotland prior to this, but now he is proclaimed the King of England, Scotland, and Ireland in 1660 in what we call the restoration of the monarchy. This is a painting of him in his coronation robes. Charles did not come back with an army and win the throne. He did not take it by force or cunning or strategy. Charles was restored or put on the throne by powerful men who thought that it was in England's best interest and in their best interest to have Charles II on that throne. One of those men was Sir John Colleton, first baronet. He was an ardent supporter of Charles I, who had lost his head, and now an ardent supporter of his son. He had fled to Barbados during Cromwell's time, and he served on the Council for Foreign Plantations when he returned. He was also a member of the Royal African Company, which was the company that had the English monopoly on the slave trade. The English weren't the only ones in the slave trade, but if you wanted to be involved in procuring and selling enslaved Africans, then you needed to do that through the Royal African Company. The future king, James II, was a member of this, and many influential men were members of this African slave trade company. Colleton was also the foremost leader of the group that would become proprietors. Look very quickly at them. I know you've probably seen them in many other presentations and publications, but I want to call attention to a couple of things here that maybe wasn't brought to your attention before. And that is those people who were associated with the Royal African Company, again, a slave trading company, those who had a Barbadian connection, and the dates of their deaths. Okay, so Colleton, he was a Barbadian slave owner. He was a member of the Royal African Company. He died in 1666. George Monk, cousin of Colleton, died in 1670. Sir William Berkeley, governor of Virginia, he would also a cousin of Colleton, he would die in 1677. John Lord Berkeley, he was a cousin of Colleton. He co-founded New Jersey. He died in 1678. Edward Hyde, the Earl of Clarendon, he would die in 1674. The remainder of the Lords Proprietors, Sir George Carteret, he co-founded New Jersey. He's a member of the Royal African Trading Company. He dies in 1680. Anthony Ashley Cooper, the Lord Proprietor we know the best. He is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's the Treasurer. He's a Barbadian slave owner. He is also a member of the Royal African Company. He'll die in 1683. And then William Lord Craven, who is also a Royal African Company member, and he will die in 1697. So again, looking at these two slides, look at the dates of these deaths: 1666, 70, 77, 78, 74, 80, 83, 97. You'll read about this period from 1670 to 1719, excuse me, as being the proprietary period. And indeed it was. 10 years beyond, it remains under proprietary management in name or on paper. But the original proprietors die off very quickly. So when we talk about the battle, the struggle between the settlers, or some of the settlers, and the proprietors, after the mid-1680s, their struggle is actually with people who were not among the original proprietors. They're with either their relatives who inherited their ownership or other people who end up being proprietors through one avenue or another. So what are these proprietors of? Charles II wants to thank the people who put him on the throne. And Colleton and some of these others are persuasive. And Charles II ends up granting the great tract known as Carolina to the Lord Proprietors in 1663. that grant will be revised in 1665 and enlarged. So on this map you're looking at, this line here is the original boundary of Carolina, and then it's extended down here. St. Augustine is up here. So Spanish territory, when you look at all old maps, stretches all the way up into North Carolina, sometimes beyond. Certainly at this point, the Spanish would have considered this to be their territory without a doubt. But the terms of the grant say it goes from the southern border of Virginia down to this boundary right here and extends west considerably. So this is the tract of land, and it's not land that had gone ignored. I won't go through each one of these, but just know that the Spanish and the French had alternately attempted settlements on this land, generally in the area of Port Royal. Spain finally abandoned St. Helena, or Elena, the area of Port Royal and Paris Island in 1587, after they heard reports of Sir Francis Drake coming up raiding Spanish settlements from the Caribbean headed north. And also they heard word of Englishmen settled not too far north at Roanoke Island. This would be Sir Walter Raleigh's colony at Roanoke, which we know as the Lost Colony. But at that time for the Spanish, they didn't know that was going to be a colony that would disappear. So they saw those threats and they got out of Dodge, and Dodge in this case being those southern bounds of Carolina. Let me shift your attention now to an island, the eastmost island in the Caribbean. It's the island that's closest to Africa, and this is the small island of Barbados. Barbados was claimed by the English in 1625, and the first attempt at settlement there was they brought a great number of indentured servants over and tried to turn it into a tobacco plantation. Virginia was meeting considerable success with its tobacco crop, so they tried to duplicate that on Barbados. The tobacco there was so bad that the planters on Barbados smoked Virginia tobacco, so that didn't work. But they did in the 1640s, with the help of the Dutch, start converting to sugar cultivation. And they very quickly started to import more laborers. They couldn't get enough servants, and the market in enslaved Africans was picking up in terms of quantity and in price. And so they started to import Africans and force them to work in the fields. So you had a mixed labor force, both white and black, on the plantations in Barbados. And this was the beginning of what they would perfect as the plantation system, using slave labor to produce a single high-value crop for export. Monoculture, where you're going to export what you produce and make big money doing it. One consequence of this in Barbados and in other places where they replicated this system was you would end up with a society that we would term today as a slave society, as opposed to a society with slaves. And I mean by that, that slavery became central to the society, to its economics, to its politics, to its culture, its way of life. And if you look very quickly at these population estimates in Barbados, you can see when sugar is first produced in Barbados, 37,000 whites or so, and about 6,000 enslaved Africans. By 1655, there's almost parity. By 1660, there is parity, and the Barbadians passed draconian laws to keep the slaves, the enslaved Africans, in check. And you can see by 1679, the Africans are in a considerable majority. And one of the big concerns that the Barbadian planters have is that they can't keep enough whites. They can't support the island. It's too small they can't support the number of blacks for the labor force and a number of whites they would like to counteract that. So they are going to be dealing with a black majority and the dangers that entails, and the suffering for the enslaved Africans, of course. And the short lifestyle, not lifestyle, lifespan, Barbados is a deadly place to be. And this is where the driving force, the key people who settle in Carolina are going to come from Barbados. And this is going to be the experience they have and the mindset that they come with. So let's talk now about Carolina. The first attempts to settle, you get some folks who come down from New England and it doesn't work out for them and they turn around and go back. There is a settlement up by the Cape Fear River, and there are Barbadians involved in that attempted settlement. The problem for them is that they are depending on the proprietors to support their efforts, to support them materially and to keep an eye on them and make whatever adjustments are necessary for their well-being. And there's plenty of distractions that prevent the proprietors from doing that. Here, I've tried to do that in one slide. You've got the Second Anglo War starts in 1664. You've got the Great Plague in London in 1665. You've got the Great Fire of London in 1666. And the supply ship that the proprietors send over to Carolina is wrecked in a storm in 1666. Bottom line, the colony goes belly up, and they once again get to a point where there's no English settlement in this tract called Carolina. But there will be a sense of urgency, and that is England has established peace with Spain. They are no longer at war with Spain, but the negotiations for a treaty that ends that war are still underway. And it becomes clear that when that treaty is signed, as they approach 1670, that the language is going to be something like this. It is agreed that the English shall have, hold, and keep those lands, regions, and islands that they have at present, that they at present hold and possess. What this means is, if the English don't have a firm grip on Carolina and they don't have a presence there, they can't back up their claim that that's English territory. So the proprietors know that it's in their best interest that they get a colony planted. And with that as a background, we reintroduce Lord Shaftesbury, Anthony Ashley Cooper, who is a surviving proprietor, Lord Proprietor, and his physician and attendant, John Locke, his secretary, some might call him. And together, they will draft a plan. Some other proprietors may be involved, a plan for Carolina that hopefully will be a key to success, because that one feeling is the former colony that failed was not closely administered. It wasn't closely governed. This is going to be a colony that will be closely governed. And the view that they have is very contradictory to the dark vision that Hobbes had. This is a quote from my book, and I'm just going to read it very quickly. Shaftesbury's writings in retrospect seem enlightened. They presage an era that celebrated reason, skepticism, freedom of thought and religion, and a general lifting of the human condition. In Locke, Shaftesbury sensed a kindred spirit, an individual who foresaw the collective potential of stable government, commercial enterprise, and common purpose. He enlisted Locke to help lay the groundwork for a self-sufficient land-based society, one that might pose a solution to England's economic, demographic, and religious problems. So this is an enlightened view. We're on the fringe front end of the Enlightenment, and Locke and Shaftesbury are taking some of those Enlightenment ideals in mind when they draft the fundamental constitutions in Carolina. And these constitutions create what some historians describe as a feudal kind of hierarchy. The Lords Proprietors hold the ultimate rights, but they've created a class of noblemen who hold titles. They own the majority of the lands. They had membership in Parliament. They had the right to be tried in the proprietor's court. Under them were the freemen who could own land but had limited role in government. And then a class called the leet men and leet women, who were tenants who were bound to the land, much like serfs had been in medieval Europe. And then below them, slaves who had no rights or property. And this was the grand model for Carolina drawn up in what is known as the Fundamental Constitution. So let's talk about Charlestown. 1670, they established Charlestown with the advice and assistance of Native Americans who warned them that Port Royal is not the best place to be. And they end up on the southern end of the Ashley River. As you know, Charlestown will relocate. When I say the end, I'm sorry, I should say the side, the boundary of the banks of the Ashley River. They will relocate about 10 years later to Oyster Point, which is the site of present-day Charleston between the Ashley and Cooper Rivers. Sir John Yeaman comes over. He will push out Governor West, and he will seize control as an early governor. He was supposed to serve as governor from the start, but he was delayed, allegedly because he had some diplomatic duties. One could also argue that he delayed his arrival until assurance from the proprietors that he would get head rights for the slaves, the enslaved Africans he was bringing. So he comes over, and just to give you a taste of the way things would go in Carolina, there's a food shortage. Freemen are releasing their servants because they can't feed them. And Yeaman comes over, and he has connections in Barbados where he can get the much needed food, but he sells it at exorbitant prices. He basically, even though he's the governor, he's a profiteer in this dire crisis. Land distribution is important in understanding what happens in Carolina. There are head rights. The freemen in the First Fleet get 150 acres for themselves, plus 150 acres for each member of their family they bring, or each servant or slave they bring. I'm sorry, 100 acres for each female or male. So you can see how quickly you could amass an enormous landholding. Those head rights would be whittled down later, 100 acres and 70 acres respectively after that. But still, if you came with a family of 4, that's 400 or 380 acres. You could bring slaves or servants to increase that amount. So huge land holdings were given out in Carolina. And I don't think that this has been pointed out by enough historians. I want to just show you very quickly. If you had settled in the town I grew up in, Watertown, Massachusetts, if you had settled there in 1636, depending on your estate, you would have gotten 25 to 80 acres. And after that, new people coming in would have gotten 13 acres. If you settled in Sudbury, Massachusetts, a little further west, here's a look, 6 grants for a house lot and 34 acres to John Goodnow. So up in New England, it was likely you were going to get somewhere in the vicinity of 25 to 50 acres. Compare that with the huge tracts that people got in South Carolina. There is no comparison. The people in South Carolina were easily able to acquire multiples of what they would have received in northern colonies. And in Stewartstown, when the Scots come over and settle south of Charleston, they give land grants that are much more like the grants in New England than the grants here in Charleston and the vicinity. So people have a lot of land, a great amount of land, and that is going to create a great need for labor, which of course will lead to a great need for enslaved Africans. The proprietors go on a recruiting binge in the 1680s, those who are still alive and other proprietors who inherit their rights. They start putting out promotional tracts to attract people from other parts of the continent, from England and from what will become Germany. They attract poor Protestants, as they will call them. And one reason that they're trying to attract them is because they are already having significant problems with the men who come over from Barbados. The immigrants from Barbados, former sugar planters or sons of planters and other men, have become the driving force in Carolina. They seize political control. They are really economically the leaders. They are the top dogs in this new colony. And what they hoped to do was to duplicate what they had done, or the people who had gone before them in Barbados, what they had done in terms of developing a crop that could be grown by enslaved laborers and exported at great profit. Problem was, they didn't have a crop. They hadn't identified a crop that would deliver that great profit. So early on, Carolina is an exporter of foodstuffs and lumber to Barbados. They are essentially feeding the inhabitants of Barbados, both free and enslaved. They also get involved in the deerskin trade. But when I say they, you're talking about just a handful of men. These Barbadian planters, who become known as the Goose Creek men because they settle at Goose Creek, will monopolize the deerskin trade. And this would include the trade in beaver pelts and in bear skins. But the deerskin exports, you can see the enormous number of deerskins, and they, in these early years, will monopolize that trade. That means that they are also monopolizing the Indian trade, because the way they're obtaining deerskins is by trading with local tribes. And it becomes clear before long that the Westo Indians will trade them not only deerskins, but will also trade them other Native Americans that the Westo can raid. And those victims, those people that the Westo sees, can be brought to Charleston and then sent out, put on ships that go to Barbados. And those poor souls will serve in Barbados until they die laboring in the sugar fields or die of the abuse out there. Another main moneymaker in the South, both in North Carolina and South Carolina, will be naval stores: pitch, turpentine, tar, resin, and lumber, because there's plenty of trees, and that generates some income. But there is no cap, and so these Barbadians and others are looking for big money makers, and that's where the deerskin trade and the trade in humans, both the importation and sale of Africans and the export and sale of Native Americans, that's how they will get rich. So let's just talk about some of the hazards and instability in South Carolina during this time. The Spanish, a constant presence down in Florida. They've been upset from the moment that the English arrived. They attacked Port Royal back in 1686. They've been subject to raids by the English, who get involved in raids on Spanish territory to obtain slaves, enslaved Indians. And then the Spanish and French are in a combined attack on Charleston in 1706. So the Spanish are there as a dangerous presence to the, and when I say South, I mean not only Florida, but also Cuba. If you look at some of the legislation passed by the Assembly in 1701, you'll see an act for the encouragement and killing of beasts of prey, an act for the prevention of runaways deserting this government, an act for the better settling and regulating of the militia, an act for settling the watch in Charlestown and preventing fires and nuisances, an act for the better ordering of slaves, and an act for raising money for the public use and defense of this province. So all of these say trouble, trouble, trouble. This province, this settlement is living in a state of peril, constant peril. Here is a detail from the Act of Prevention of Runaways. Any person who deserts Carolina by running away to Virginia and other governments was decreed a runaway, subject to a fine or 6 months imprisonment. And the colony, the Assembly, was willing to hire colonists or Native Americans to be rewarded for the capture of fugitives, and they were given legal right to beat, maim, assault, or even kill any colonists who resisted. So that gives you some idea of conditions in Carolina, that people were trying to run away and were being brought back by force and held in by force. That does not speak well of the colony. And you're all familiar with this picture. I use it on the cover of my book, Grim Years. This is a map of Charleston, the crisp map, 1711, and it's clearly a fortress. It's a fortified city, which tells you that they are afraid of the Spanish and the French and Native Americans who are not their allies. Here's a quote from an Anglican minister speaking of the people in Charleston. People here are the vilest race of men upon the earth. They have neither honor, nor honesty, nor religion enough to entitle them to any tolerable character. A perfect medley of hodgepodge, bankrupts, pirates, decayed libertines, sectaries, and enthusiasts of all sorts. They are the most factious and seditious people in the whole world. So obviously it was a society that was torn by a lot of different interests. One was religious interests. This is a famous work by Daniel Defoe talking about the injustice wreaked upon the dissidents in Carolina. Here's a quote from him, but I don't want to use up too much time on that. Just know there's a lot of religious dissent going on. There's also problems in Carolina that are, some are the fault of the settlers, some they can't do much about except become victims. Epidemics, the malaria outbreaks, the yellow fever epidemics, smallpox outbreaks, they aren't just victims. Bringing in slave ships contributes to this, and poor nutrition, mistreated people lends to the spread of disease. And so they have some share of blame in the disease environment. Hurricanes, they can't be blamed for that, but there were serious hurricanes that challenged the colony at different points. In some cases, taking all the ships in the harbor and washing them up on the shores. Major fires, every colonial city had fires. Charleston was no exception. And that, of course, was in a time when there's no insurance, no government aid. Fires were devastating. And then pirates, again, the colonists had some blame in this. They traded with the pirates. Pirates needed supplies. The colonists loved the fact that pirates came armed with gold and silver. And you've probably heard about the notorious episode when Blackbeard basically set up camp in Charleston Harbor and held a city hostage until he got the supplies, including the medical supplies he needed, medical supplies to treat syphilis among his crew. So these are things going on, and politically, the situation is not much better. There's chaos. There were 19 different men appointed in those 50 years, the first 50 years, 19 men appointed to the position of governor. There were crises in politics stemming from the religious infighting between Anglicans and the Goose Creek men from Barbados were Anglicans, by the way, and dissenters. The colonists refused to ratify the fundamental constitutions. Historians have credited or discredited the Goose Creek men from Barbados as leading the opposition to the proprietors. The proprietors eventually had to appoint separate governors for North Carolina and South Carolina, dividing the two colonies because the North Carolinians were so upset that they were so poorly represented, their interests so poorly represented in Charleston. And of course, in 1719, the colonists would reject proprietary rule. So it was instability and chaos. Let me talk a little bit about slavery. Thomas Jefferson famously pointed out that no man will labor for himself who can make another labor for him in a hot climate such as South Carolina. This quote from a Native American, noting the greatest traffic between the English and the savages is the trade in slaves in 1700. In 1708, Thomas Nairn, who would become a commissioner for the Indian slave trade, proposed that they could enslave any Native Americans and build a plantation economy based on African and Indian slaves on the ruins of Indian villages. These are ads from a Boston newspaper that if you read them, you would see each one involves a Carolina Indian who had been from Carolina into Boston. And this last one is about a runaway slave who ran away from Samuel Adams, Malta. So we know that Sam Adams, the famous patriot, grew up in a household where his father had purchased Carolina, at least one Carolina Indian, maybe more. The proprietors had ensured that enslaved Africans would come with head rights in Carolina. And so very quickly, settlers, not just from Barbados, but from other places, including the Huguenots from France and other settlers from England, concluded that in Carolina, if you want to do well, you have to have slaves. And these quotes are talking about how success is dependent on owning enslaved Africans. And John Norris talking about the profitability of slaves. So in South Carolina, the slave population would grow very quickly as they imported these Africans. They made an effort to import whites fast enough to counterbalance that, but that did not work. And the great danger of an African uprising was matched by the danger of a Native American uprising, and that took place in 1715 with the Yamasee War, when Native Americans finally had enough of this slave trade. And as you probably know, given that you're all interested in South Carolina history, not long after in 1739, you had the first major slave uprising in the continental, the British colonies in North America, the Stono Rebellion. So I want to go back and finish with Hobbes. He wrote, "Where every man is enemy to every man, in such condition there is continual fear and danger of violent death in the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." And if we look at the challenges that had faced the people in South Carolina, it was in many ways a condition of war of everyone against everyone. Political strife, economic competition, religious strife, competition for land, fighting back against the proprietors, conflict with Native Americans, with the Spanish, the threat of slave uprising, the threat of a servant uprising, the problems with diseases, with storms and fires. It was danger and instability throughout during that first 50 years. And what we see with the introduction of rice, beginning in 1695, but really flourishing after 1720, you could see the rice shipments really take off around 1710, and by 1720, it's the major crop in South Carolina. We would see South Carolina would become a colony that would be rule, if you will, in the British Crown. It would become incredibly valuable, not only to the planters, but also to the king and to the empire. And they would, in fact, plant Georgia pretty much as a military buffer to defend the rice fields in Carolina. And the success of those rice planters came at the expense of everyone else in Carolina, came at the expense of the Native Americans, at the expense of the enslaved Africans, and the expense of most of the planters, the smaller planters in South Carolina, who didn't have the means to become the rice planters, who by the 1750s would be the richest men in the Western Hemisphere. I write about this story in my book, The Grim Years the Grim Years Settling South Carolina, 1670 to 1720. And I've got a list of some other works that, if you're interested, you could look at them. As be glad to return that screen later on. But right now, let me stop with the slides and invite any questions that folks might have. I know that was rattling fast. Sorry, but I had a lot of ground to cover, and I am from Boston. We all talk fast up there.
That was great, John. Okay, I know we've got at least one on here so far. We had a question, and I believe it was while you were talking about the fundamental constitutions. It said, "What understandings about the period of your book do you challenge or modify in it?"
Well, one thing is they talk about this period up to 1719 as the proprietary period. And I would describe it as the disintegration of proprietary ownership or proprietary rule. The settlers never never agreed to the fundamental constitutions. They never really followed the rule, the advice, the guidance, or the laws set out by the proprietors. So what you see is a battle from day one. And people think of 1719 as some critical moment where they threw off proprietary rule. Well, the truth is the Barbadians threw off proprietary rule, I think, the moment they stepped off the boat. So that's one thing. Another thing that I try to do, I can't say it's entirely different, but my focus in the book I wrote, The Grim Years, is trying to look at people who you would characterize as victims. It's easy to write about the big guys, the names the leaders, the people who had the big plantations, the people who were at the top of the political pyramid. But what I try to do is show the sufferings of the Native Americans, the sufferings of the enslaved Africans, and then show the hardships faced by the common settlers. The majority of people in South Carolina did not succeed. They did not do well. They persisted to some degree. Many of them died quickly or died prematurely. But what I tried to show is that South Carolina was a dreadful place to be for any number of reasons, but it was far worse than it had to be. And that was because self-interest was ruling the day, and circumstances allowed a handful of very greedy men, no other word for it, greedy. They seized economic and political reins, and they succeeded wonderfully at the expense of everyone else. Long-winded answer, but I hope that provides somewhat of a response.
I think it does, and you may have answered this this next question in that. They said, did it all come down to who wrote the laws and carried the biggest gun? It sounds like it came down to who had the land, but
well, in a sense, it wasn't their ability to write laws so much as it was their ability to ignore laws. If you look at the fundamental constitutions as the laws set out, the rules set out, I mean, it was a very detailed plan on what they were to do, how they were to settle, what the land holdings would be, what your titles would be, what the form of government would be. And they basically said, the heck with that. And so they formed an assembly, which was not allowed, which was not called for. They ignored the rule of the proprietors. They did draft their own laws, and laws that favored their own interests. So, for example, they did things to try and get around paying rents to the proprietors, which was one of the main ways that the proprietors were going to get some benefit out of this great grant that they had received. They passed laws so that the state could seize property if somebody died, and the widow and the children, the descendants, could lose out, so that these men had an opportunity to seize it and get the best lands and acquire enough lands to start these big plantations. They ignored laws and strict instructions from the proprietors about the Indian slave trade. To their credit, the Lord's proprietors tried to restrict enslavement of Indians to the enslavement of Indians, of Native Americans who had waged war against the English, because they considered it just to enslave enemies taken in war. The Barbadians and others totally ignored that. And the Scots who settled at Stewartstown, they ignored that at their own peril. And the Native Americans came back and wiped that town, wiped that settlement off the face of the earth, pretty much. So the South Carolinians did what they needed to, the key men in power did what they needed to advance their own interests. Did they have the biggest guns? Well, they controlled the Indian trade, which meant they controlled who got the guns, settlers' guns. But the fact is, the militia was controlled by these men, these political hacks, and also which Native Americans got guns was also controlled by these Indians and their peers. Other questions?
Interesting. Yes, Carol wondered if you could talk briefly about women indentured servants.
Female indentured servants, one generalization, and generalizations are always dangerous. I'm constantly harping to my classes about this. Be careful about generalizing. Well, white women weren't supposed to be in the field. That was commonly accepted in most colonies. So even up in Virginia, when they brought women in, and they were known to bring boatloads of women in, they were being brought in to be wives and what you might call domestic servants. Women could work in the fields if they were Native American or if they were African, but not if they were Christians, not if they were white. And a Christian African could be worked in the field. So I should even leave Christian off the list. If they were white, they weren't supposed to be in the fields. The indentured servants who came to South Carolina, like most colonies, there was a gender disparity. Not enough women to go around for the men. So it's unlikely that a lot of women would have been asked or required to do any field work. I don't want to say it didn't happen, but that would have been the exception. Even in Barbados, they preferred to not put white women in the fields. They did want female indentured servants, but they had other uses for them, including sexual abuse. And we know from records in Virginia and elsewhere, some men would bring over female servants just so they could release them from their indenture and marry them, because there weren't enough women to go around. Is that somewhat close to an answer?
I think so.
I wish I could tell you that there's a certain percent of workers in the fields that were female, but I have not seen that in any historical work.
Yeah.
Might be something, but I haven't read it.
Okay. Devin asked, you mentioned early in the lecture that when they were choosing Charleston as a settlement site, Indians warned them away from Point Royal. What were the reasons?
I believe the Native Americans argued that the other Native Americans in the area were unfriendly, that the Spanish would be a greater threat down there, and that there was a safer place that they could come. And what they wanted, what the Native Americans wanted, of course, was to put the English in a better position for them to trade with. One thing we see up and down the eastern coast is Native Americans looking at the English colonists as potential allies against their enemies and as trading partners. It's why Chief Wingina welcomes the English onto Roanoke Island. It's why the Massasoit protects the settlers at Plymouth, because they could be a valuable ally and good trading partners. We see that with Powhatan in Virginia. He could have wiped out Jamestown, but he doesn't, because he'd rather bring them into his orbit, into his confederacy. And in South Carolina, Native Americans wanted the same thing. Good allies, good trading partners, especially when your allies have guns and cannon, which their rivals, other Native American tribes, do not have.
Okay. Here is a question. Were there any Jesuit missions at St. Helena? You mean St. Helena, I guess?
That's a good question about Jesuits. The Jesuits and the Franciscans were the two dominant orders in the colonies. The Franciscans started up in New France before the Jesuits got there. Franciscans were strong in New Spain, of course. They would have been among the Spanish at St. Helena, but whether the Jesuits were there at any earlier moment, not that I know of, because the Spanish generally traveled paired up with the Franciscan order.
Okay. And there is a question. Yes, we will send you all a link to if you want to rewatch this on YouTube. And another question, I think we have time for one more. Could Dr. Navin talk about how the Spanish presence at St. Augustine and the contest for empire in the colonial Southeast shaped the development of early South Carolina?
Well, for one thing, it gave them an enemy at their doorstep. So that was that figured into the South Carolina's construction, its layout, its creation as a fortified city. As I showed you from the crisp drawing, South Carolina was bracing for an assault from the time that they arrived, and it's good for them that they did, because the assaults came. They also provoked assaults by being aggressive in their own right. Also, the presence of the Spanish governor actually brought runaway Africans in, and it became known that runaway slaves could go to St. Augustine. I've read that they were supposed to convert to Catholicism, but the word among the enslaved Africans in Carolina was, if you can get to Florida, there's freedom waiting there. And that became a real problem. When we talk about rebellions like the Stono Rebellion, where were those rebels, those escaped slaves, if you will, headed? They were headed south to St. Augustine. So that's one of the impacts. And then the planting of Georgia was really, as I said, it was a buffer colony to protect the valuable rice fields in South Carolina. So the very presence of an English neighbor to their south was partly due to St. Augustine. And then if we look at the wars between England and France, Spain is often involved in that as an ally of France. And so in wars like King George's War, or the earlier wars, Queen Anne's War, you see that the South Carolinians have to worry not only about the Spanish in St. Augustine, but also Cuba. I hope that answers that question.
Ah, interesting. And we have time for one quick one. When did the South Carolina economy switch to indigo?
About 1745. Thank you to Eliza Lucas Pinckney, whose father was in Antigua and sending her things to give it a try, see if this works. And indeed, that did work, and that becomes South Carolina's second major crop, rice and then indigo. But one of the things you asked me earlier, or somebody asked me what is different in my book, what's new. One thing that I point out in the book that I think escapes a lot of attention in other works is, for the first 25 years, there is no main cash crop. So they have to turn to all these other ways to make money. They don't start developing rice until 1695. And so the first 50 years, building up to what we would call the rice period, beginning in the 1720s, when rice will become the big money maker. But until 1695, there was no rice at all. And then you've got 25 years of development, if you will, but you also have all kinds of stress and a war, the Yamasee War in that, and an overthrow of the proprietors. So those second 25 years, while rice is starting to be planted and settling as the dominant crop, it's also years that a lot of people are being pushed off the land to make those plantations, and a lot of Africans are being imported to work on those plantations. And a lot of Native Americans are going to die in various ways because of the desire to raise money. It's the slave trade that finances those plantations, both the African slave trade and the Native American slave trade. It was a grim period for most everybody in Savannah, except a handful of very selfish men who succeeded in ways that nobody else did.
Your book is certainly well titled.
Could I just say that I would be glad to answer other questions if people want to email me. I'll even take a call if I'm in the office not teaching, but the best way to reach me would be by email, jnavin@coastal.edu, and I'd be glad to talk with you, or at least try to handle your questions as best I can.
That's very kind of you. And I am sorry we could not get to everyone's questions, but it's obvious from the comments that everyone enjoyed the presentation a great deal. So thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Navin. And we appreciate everyone who did attend. I hope you'll go to the website at schistory.org to look at our future programs. And if you are not a member, I hope you'll join in supporting the society by becoming a member. Thank you again, Dr. John Navin. This was fabulous.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you. Good night.
Thank you, and have a good evening, everyone.